Welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, here with my co-host, Matt Giraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And we are very excited to get into our top 25 wide receiver ranks today. We did quarterbacks last week. We're going to be doing wide receivers now. And for 3 wide receiver leagues, this video is very important. We're only going to get into the top 25 here, but in 3 wide receiver leagues, it really is important even past that. So once we get all of our top rankings out for each position group, we will dive deeper into the receivers than this coming down the line. So stay tuned with us to make sure that you get all of that content as we continue to put it out. So we will start with tier 1 here, and we will go through 6 tiers of these top 25 wide receivers. We try to space it out relatively evenly. So tier 1, we got the elite wide receiver 1s here, and we're going to start off with CeeDee Lamb.
CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver 1 last year. Dak finished as QB3. Don't really have a lot of target competition with CeeDee. The running game isn't supposed to be spectacular, so I wouldn't necessarily need to spend a whole lot of time on this. I think he's kind of locked and loaded as that top tier. Now, some people do have Tyreek ahead of him, but I think consensus right now is really trending towards CeeDee as number 1.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think on CeeDee Lamb, you look up at last year and like halfway through the year, it just felt like Tyreek Hill was for sure going to finish as wide receiver 1. He was so good early in the year. I mean, he torched the Chargers in week 1, and it just felt like he was going to stay there pretty much no matter what. And then CeeDee Lamb kind of crept up, and then went off in the final week of the season. He had over 30 points in week 17, and that kind of pushed him over Tyreek Hill last year. Like, he finished as the number 1 wide receiver last year. He had 180 targets. He had 1,750 yards with 12 touchdowns, and his situation isn't going to change. He is going to continue to see that volume of work. And not to say anything against Tyreek Hill, and if you want to have him as your number 1 receiver, I wouldn't blame you, but it's just really hard to ignore how much upside CeeDee has from week to week and how heavily targeted he gets every single week. There's no dips here. He's an excellent receiver to have on your team and somebody that I would be very excited to draft if I got the opportunity. So getting into the second receiver that I just mentioned here, and talking about mini tiers within these tiers, again, these top 2 receivers I think are going to be pretty much consensus amongst all of the rankers here between CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill. So I really like Tyreek Hill again this year. I mean, he's just so explosive. It's so nice to have somebody on your team that every week it feels like you look up and he's got a 60-yard touchdown. And he did that, I think, like 8 or 9 times again last year. So there's nobody better at the big play than Tyreek Hill. And, it's just week over week has a chance to just single-handedly win you the week. And so that's somebody that I want on my team.
Yeah, and when you mentioned week 1 against the Chargers last year, we were facing off against each other in our home league, and I had Tua, so I was feeling pretty good. And like you said with Tyreek, he can just win you any given week. Now, on the downside, there's more competition for targets and touches on that team. They do want to run the ball, but man, when you just watch the game, he's just running around like crazy, and you're just not going to be able to pass on him unless it's for CeeDee Lamb or Christian McCaffrey.
If he's open, he's the first read. He's getting the ball. They get him the ball on all different levels too, screens, slants, hooks, because he's so good at that, with getting so much respect on his deep speed. And then obviously the big plays. I mean, it's just he wins at all levels, and just an excellent pick here. All right, so number 3, this is where we get into kind of this little mini tier within the elites. And I think this is going to surprise some people anyways, because going into the offseason even, I wouldn't have necessarily had Amon-Ra at 3, but I think with, the next 2 guys that we get into, they do come with some additional question marks that Amon-Ra doesn't have. Same offense, same weapons. Goff is still there. He proved last year that he has as much upside as anybody. I mean, he finished as wide receiver 3, even though he missed 2 weeks, and went down in another week. So, just unbelievable upside, consistent 20-point producer and half-point PPR. And with that level of stability, I've come around more on Amon-Ra St. Brown than I thought I even was going to, because, the level of being able to produce week over week, despite not having maybe as much, any given game upside as the 2 in front of him. I think just the high level of production week over week is something that, can really help your team win, and is a good way to start your draft.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I was being progressive when I put him ahead of Jefferson, and now I see you have him above Chase and Jefferson, and I'm not quite there yet. I still want to have Chase one spot ahead. As I told you yesterday, I'm feeling very confident leaving round one with St. Brown as my anchor wide receiver, especially in a three wide receiver format.
Yeah, so I agree. And I pushed him up. I feel like the theme for me has been, I'm a little more risk averse. I think anything can happen once you get to the playoffs. So picking guys that you feel will be on the field, have an established role, and you know what you're getting when you draft them is something that's very important to me. Um, so, anyways, that's why I have additionally pushed him up. So, and you mentioned Chase, which isn't even my next ranked guy. We've got at number 4, Justin Jefferson. And unfortunately, this isn't due to him. Okay, there's no reason that he's going to regress, right? It's the quarterback play. And if he's going to go from Kirk Cousins to JJ McCarthy, I just don't have the same level of confidence that McCarthy's going to be able to put up major passing yard totals that we've seen from Cousins throughout his entire career. So, um, Justin Jefferson is an awesome player. He's going to be open. It's just going to be a matter of what his catchable target percentage is going to be. Because if that goes down to into the 60s, it's just going to be really, really difficult for him to continue to produce at the elite level that he can.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're going to orchestrate the offense around him, but I've, laid out my concerns with McCarthy and, potentially Darnold too, if they do give him the nod the first couple weeks. But
Please don't.
yeah, yeah, I know. But no, he should be quarterback proof, and he's obviously an elite player, so I'm fine with him here.
Yeah, and I mean he's quarterback proof in the fact that we still have him among the elites, and he's still going to be an early first round pick, right? It's not like we're talking about dropping him in any significant way. It's just among these players, it's just knocking him down a couple spots here just because of the concerns of the quarterback. Somebody that I'll still heavily target, right? Somebody that in the first round, I still have him as my 5th overall player. And honestly, if I have the 4th pick, McCaffrey's going to go. He's going to go first or second. I probably wouldn't make that decision, but you're sitting at 5 and Jefferson's there. That's going to be my pick pretty much every time. Even in 10-team superflex, in 12-team superflex, it's different. I would likely pick quarterback. Say if one of the top 3 were still there, like Lamar. But in a 10-team superflex, I'm still going within this group with my top pick, and trying to attack quarterback at one of the later tiers. So that's my opinion on Jefferson. So the final player in this tier is obviously Jamar Chase, and that's who you have up at 3. So I'll give you a chance to give him or give a positive spin on him.
Yeah, the only man that outperformed Justin Jefferson on the same team at LSU, Jamar Chase, just lightning in a bottle. Unfortunately, last year,
wide receiver can't let go of college, huh? We're 4 years down the line, still talking about 2019 when they were on the same team.
one of the greatest teams we've really ever seen.
Greatest college football team ever.
But like I said, wide receiver 13, but he had one game where he scored 37 half PPR points. So it could have been even worse than that. And, when Burrow was on the field, he had a 28% target share. When Burrow was injured, it dropped down to just over 20% with Browning. A much riskier pick than really any of these guys that we've discussed. I mean, you're kind of banking on those spike weeks. You're banking on the talent. You're banking on, the fact that defenses have to account for T. Higgins as well. Kind of just a homer for this guy. He's one of my favorite players, and, we've seen what he can do. But like I said about St. Brown, where I feel very confident going into round two, if I have Chase, do I take that second receiver? Do I go quarterback in Superflex? Do I see what kind of running back is there? A few more question marks, but, I think he's solidified in this tier. There's just a few other, variables that, you're going to have to deal with.
Yeah. And for me on the negative side, like, I really just don't know that he has the same explosion that we saw as a rookie. I mean, the defenses just play constant cover two against them now, cover two shell, and him getting open over the middle. I mean, he has a lot of games where if he doesn't have a big score, it just turns into a disappointing game. I mean, even from this level of player, if you're getting like 7 for 65, which he did a couple times last year, it's just leaves a lot to be desired from your top player. And these other guys, I just don't think do that with as much frequency. So that's why I'm not as big on Chase. I understand he's got all the explosiveness in the world, right? And he can easily have these massive spike weeks. I still have him as my 6th overall player. I would still be very comfortable drafting him 6 overall, even in 10-team superflex. I'd probably still draft him ahead of the first quarterback. Maybe not. Maybe Josh Allen. But I'm not even considering a second running back before Chase. So this isn't like I don't like Chase. Okay, don't take it as I don't like Chase. I will be drafting Chase pretty much whenever I can get him at 6, right? It's just that a lot of people like him more than this. And so I'm probably just not going to get him that much. I probably will get either Jefferson or Amon-Ra at the 6th overall pick, right? And those guys don't carry as much pedigree. Well, Jefferson does, but the quarterback issue just, limits his situation. So like in terms of the upside and the consistency of situation, right? Chase has all of those things going for him. So I totally don't fault anybody for having him at 3 or 4. It's just for me, I have him at 5 and I don't expect to get him a ton. All right. So going down to the tier 2, which is back end of wide receiver 1, right? We got the near elite. We're not even going to get into 10 in this tier, right? Where there's going to be another tier before we get to wide receiver 10. And to kick off this tier, I think we did a breakdown, actually, a breakdown video on this tier of receivers. So go back and watch that if you want even further analysis on this group. But we're going to start off with
AJ Brown. Unlike a few others that we'll talk about in this tier, we don't necessarily have to project like we will with, a Garrett Wilson, for example. We've seen him do it year over year. He's only 26 years old. They brought in Kellen Moore, who I think is going to be a jolt to this offense. Last year, it was really pathetic. They just kind of ran those two guys down the field. There was no motion. There was no play action. There was really nothing. And I think Kellen Moore is going to really be licking his chops, having a guy like AJ Brown. And I think, what we talked about before is there is a little bit of fatigue with, fantasy players that have kind of seen these guys do it year over year. Maybe they're pushing Puka above him because he's kind of the shiny new toy. But AJ Brown, man, he's just an absolute monster on the field. And, if I have a late round pick in the first round, he's someone that I'm probably going to be targeting quite a bit.
Totally agree with everything you said. And I know he fell off at the end of last year. I know there was frustration around having
the whole team fell off. I mean,
that's what I was going to say is it's just not the same situation this year, right? It's the teams figured out what they were doing. The linebackers pushed out, outside the seams, and they weren't running the ball. They weren't running any sort of routes over the middle. Goddard was hurt and wasn't able to even work the middle of the field hardly at all during that time. So it was just this weird conglomeration of like the players and the coaches weren't on the same page with where the offense was. That's not going to happen this year. And he's going to go right back to the player I think he was early in the season, where he had 5 straight games of over 125 yards. There just aren't very many players that can do that or that have that level of upside. And he's one of them, right? And we've seen the touchdown upside from him. We've seen him be really good off of play action, going over the middle. One of the best receivers at that in the league. So I really think that, he's going to alleviate a lot of the concerns that we saw towards the end of the year this season. And I expect him to have a huge season. So number 7, we have Garrett Wilson. So for me, this is obviously a risky pick. This is kind of where he was last year. We were really hoping for a good season with him and Rodgers, right? And obviously when Rodgers got hurt, they didn't have a backup plan. They didn't know kind of what they were doing. There was calls on them to go sign Flacco or just figure out something else other than Zach Wilson, which never really materialized until later in the year. The offense settled down and he ended up being a major, major volume play. So he did work his way back into like the top 15 type of weekly plays. So, it's good to know kind of where that floor is. They have Tyrod Taylor as a backup now, which I think will be able to float him much better than Zach Wilson did last year if something were to happen to Rodgers. So you can have some solace in that. But with Rodgers healthy, I think that the sky is the limit here for Garrett Wilson. He's gone over 1,000 yards in both of his 2 seasons, despite the worst quarterback play of any receiver that we've had, right? The literally 32nd among quarterback play. And so even if he gets middle of the pack quarterback play from Aaron Rodgers, right? And we know that Rodgers is extremely accurate, doesn't turn the ball over, really good on the sideline with back shoulder throws. Like there's going to be a lot of chemistry things that I think are going to even be improved on from going into last year that I think can carry into this year, and that Garrett Wilson's going to be a major factor in fantasy.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing to watch Rodgers in the red zone with his number one receiver, and I think Garrett Wilson's just going to route guys up, and Rodgers is just going to deliver it on the money, kind of like what we saw in that preseason game last year and the rapport that they were building. I'm very excited about Garrett Wilson, man. He's one of those guys where if it doesn't pan out, we can revisit next year, but I think the stars are really aligning here for him.
Yeah, I agree. All right, and then getting into number 8, and the last guy in this tier. We might have one more in this tier, I forget. But yeah, Puka Nacua. So I'll tee it up to you to open on Puka Nacua.
Yeah, I mean, what a surprise last year was as a rookie, just kind of breaking all of those records. And obviously with Kupp missing a lot of the season, he was really able to step up and shine in that number one role. And, we know how Stafford loves to support his number one. My only reason I'm kind of hesitant on Nacua, and I haven't really drafted him much of anywhere this year, is, in the games where he and Kupp were on the field at the same time, Nacua still was the number one, but he was averaging wide receiver 12, per week, and Kupp was only wide receiver 23. So the gap was a little bit smaller than, what I would be comfortable with drafting as a true number one. If I'm looking at the other guys on this list, they are all bona fide number ones. And even if Kupp goes up to like 1B-ish, there's still some question marks that I think I'm just going to go in a different direction here.
Yeah, and that's the tough part about ranking him, right? Is that we put him here because he just had a record-breaking rookie season. I mean, he literally broke Jamar Chase's record for receiving yards in a season for a rookie. He went over 1,400 yards as a rookie. And the thing that I like to point at here is he had 23 points per game in those first 4 games without Kupp. And then Kupp comes back, and Kupp continued to struggle with being the same player and being completely healthy the whole year, right? But then the gap on that kind of closed. It was like 16 points per game for Puka and 14 points per game for Kupp over the last part of the year, right? And that's in full PPR, those numbers, but so a little less than half. But, the major amount of data that was fueling his overall production came in those first 4 weeks. And, as long as Kupp is healthy going into this season, I just have a really hard time believing that he's going to elevate to even another level, which is where I think he kind of needs to be in order to pay off this draft position. So it's tough because if he does, right, then he can even be better than this. But if he doesn't, which I'm, little hesitant to think he will, it's setting up for a little bit of a letdown here, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously with Kupp's age and with his injury history, like he's a very good candidate to miss time, unfortunately, this upcoming season. And, people will make that argument that are pushing Nacua up the boards, but then, they'll make the opposite argument when they're pushing someone like Devontae Adams up the board too. So you can kind of spin it in any way you want. But I hope him for the best, and maybe Stafford can support those two number ones. But yeah, I'm just still a little gun shy at his ADP.
Yeah, no, and if Kupp hadn't have been so good the last 2 years, right? Like in 2021 and 2022, I mean, he was just so much better than everybody else at wide receiver. It was like him, and then a major step down, even to Tyreek Hill in terms of points per game. He was so dominant over that time. Over 1,900 yards in one of those seasons, pushing the single season record. So, it's just, and I get that he might have lost a step. I get that the injury or the nagging soft tissue injuries might still affect him, and he might miss time. But, if he is healthy, again, it's just really hard to ignore that elite level of player that Kupp has been. So, yeah, that's I think we've kind of thoroughly gone through it. I think maybe it's made. Like you said about supporting two number ones, maybe it's just we have Kupp too low, and that he's going to end up being a steal this year. But we'll see how it plays out. All right, so tier 3, low end wide receiver runs ones, right? So this would be like the kind of 9 to 12 range here. And starting this off is Devontae Adams. So I'll take this one to start because I definitely am going to be higher on Adams than a lot of people in the industry are, just because I value the consistency. I value the fact that he is the clear number one, right? Obviously, Jacoby Myers will have his games. And I actually think that's a benefit, right? He's not necessarily a awesome number two, but he's good enough to kind of garner some attention. And if there's too much attention on Adams, they can go to Jacoby and open up Adams as the game moves forward. But I think Antonio Pierce was really good for Adams in terms of getting him the ball and loading him up with targets. So as long as that's going to continue to be the plan, I think that's great. And also, I think the quarterback play this year is going to be significantly better than it was last year. And Devontae finished as wide receiver 11 last year in half point PPR. And that was with the poor quarterback play. So either Minshew's going to take over and he's going to become have even a higher floor, or Aiden O'Connell's going to win the job. And, that's going to mean that he had to elevate past what Minshew would be able to do. So I expect the quarterback play here to be better. I expect Adams to be more consistent, and that's really what the issue is that he has all of the ability to go for a spike week, right? Over 150 and 2 touchdowns. When you see that, it's like, oh, Adams had a vintage Adams game, right? But the problem is when he goes 1 for 4 against Kansas City and they don't throw it in the second half, right? Like that happened last year in week 16. So I can understand anybody that had Adams just has a sour taste in their mouth because he lost them their week in the playoffs type of thing, So
Yeah.
there's give and take here, but Adams is somebody that I still believe in and that I'm going to be targeting in drafts higher than most.
And we saw how Minshew supported Pittman, so the precedent is there.
Agreed, and loaded him up with targets, and Pittman was a weekly top 10 receiver last year. So I think, that Adams can be that as well for Minshew. So all right, going into number 10 here, we got Chris Olave. And this is another reason why I took the Devontae Adams analysis, because obviously this is your favorite player to look at here.
Yeah, so Olave is, just one of my all-around favorite players. Finished at, wide receiver 19 last year. A little bit of a disappointment based on where he was drafted. But, my thing with him is coming into his, year 3 season, he's the clear number 1 target on the team. The ADP gap between him and Rashid Shaheed is like 46 spots. And, looking at the offense last year, it was kind of anemic. They brought in Clint Kubiak, who's definitely going to be a jolt to it. Last year, they used pre-snap motion less than like any team. Early reports from camp is they're using a ton of pre-snap motion. They're using a ton of play action. They invested a first-round pick on the offensive line when some people thought they might have invested it in a wide receiver. So I really think, this is the year for him to take a major, major step forward.
Even with Derek Carr?
Your favorite quarterback, yeah.
Yeah, right. No, I agree. I think Olave is going to be much more of a focal point on the offense. I think the negative with Olave, or the reason I'm maybe a little less enthusiastic than you on Olave specifically, is I just can't stand at the 2-minute warning having 1 catch for 2 yards. Like I feel like sometimes he disappears throughout periods of the game. And whether that's his fault, whether it's Carr's fault, whether it's the scheme's fault, whatever you want to put that on, the fact of the matter is that it happens. And so until he overcomes that, I just am always going to hesitate at Olave until we see a season where that isn't the case and that he's always involved in the game plan and that he is going to consistently produce throughout games. I think that's really what holds me back. And whether or not that's fair.
I think that's totally fair. Man, I mean, I think if things don't work out this year and the narrative is the same next year, then, we're going to be like, okay, pump the brakes. But, just too much talent.
Yeah. And I was going to say whether or not that's fair, because there are times where you'll look up at the end of the game and he'll have 8 for 90, or he'll have 5 for 75 and a touchdown, right? And he does that in a quarter. But imagine if he just had 3 for 30 in the first half. How much better those games would look when he goes off in a certain half, right? And just being even like peripherally involved in the first half or in the second half, and when he has a major half on the other part of the game would just help his overall production and his overall consistency, I think, quite a bit. So Um, that's my take on Olave. I still do like him, right? I still in drafts with you, I'm not going to get him, right? But in drafts where you're not a part of the drafts, I still will target him. Third round pick, especially in 10 team superflex. I think you could do worse than him in the third round. And if he happens to last into the beginning of the fourth round, around pick 30, 33, like you're getting a very, very good value there with Chris Olave. So going into number 11, this is the hardest player for me to rank amongst this tier of wide receivers because Marvin Harrison obviously is one of the best prospects that we've seen in a long time. It's just, how do we know exactly how he's going to assimilate in? Is he going to get 140 targets from Kyler right off the rip and have 100 receptions in his rookie season? Or is it going to be, feathered in slowly at the beginning and then ends up around 115 or 120 targets, doesn't quite get to 1,000 yards? That's kind of the career trajectory for a lot of really good prospect receivers, is around 900 to 1,000 yards in their first year is still looked at as a very, very successful year. But if you're going to say that that's a success and draft them at 11th overall, you're going to be disappointed. So I expect him to be very good. I expect him to beat that 900 to 1,000. I hope he's up around 1,200 yards. It gets into that 7 or 8 touchdown range, and really is an asset for your team. But with my downside concerns on him, he's somebody that I also can see just like waiting around, or maybe that's where I decide to attack running back or quarterback and then get a third receiver or second receiver a little later in the draft. So what do you think on Harrison?
First and foremost, I just want to say I'm very proud of you for putting a rookie this high, because this is very out of character for you. And if anyone is drafted with Trevor and myself over the years, we know we value these guys very differently. And, I have Harrison right here at 11, just for all the reasons that you just stated. Best wide receiver prospect we've seen since maybe Calvin Johnson, going into a perfect situation with Kyler. We've seen Kyler support a top 5 wide receiver in D-Hop. All of these boxes are just perfectly being checked, other than the fact that we have 0 sample size on him. But this guy's looked like an NFL receiver since his sophomore year at Ohio State. I know it's different, but I mean, the pedigree, it's just everything, man. I think he's going to be really set up for success. But we haven't really seen a wide receiver be pushed up this high. I mean, in the typical year, someone like Malik Neighbors would have been the number 1 wide receiver prospect, where he's going around that 25 ADP is kind of that sweet spot. So this is kind of uncharted territory, but he's someone, when I look around and look towards someone like Ayuk, who has got, a million different guys vying for the ball, I'm just going to go with Harrison.
Yeah. And I think talking about the pedigree, maybe framing the pedigree in a way that is, a little easier to understand than just he was great in college. He actually was on the same team with Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, who we have at 7 and 10 here. And even when he was a sophomore, when they were all on the same team, it was like Marvin Harrison and then everybody else, right? In terms of how they looked at their receivers, in terms of talent, in terms of, production and everything. So
yeah, I mean, their wide receiver coach ranked him Harrison, JSN, Wilson, then Scary Terry, then Olave, which is an awesome group of guys.
Yeah, which is all really good receivers, right? And obviously JSN is in a much different situation than these 3 that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And he's a different player too, right? I mean, he's much more at the line of scrimmage type of receiver compared to these 3. But framing the pedigree with the players that you see here and the guys that you do know can maybe help you understand why you would be high on them, right? In the similar situation with Chase when he came in, right? Chase was the number 1 on Jefferson, and that's why so many people, even as a rookie, were really high on Chase. And that ended up paying off in a major way. If you took Chase in like the 5th round, I think is where his ADP was as a rookie, and he went for 1,400 yards and 14 touchdowns. It's just like such an advantage to have a player like that. And I think that
when I drafted him, everyone was like, "Oh, he's." Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think the Chase success is playing into pushing up Marvin Harrison as well. But yeah,
Yeah.
I remember when you drafted him after all those reports that he was dropping passes in minicamp or whatever, he was saying he couldn't see the ball because he was used to the stripe on the college ball versus there isn't one on the
Yeah.
NFL ball. So getting used to that kind of stuff is reasonable. Just I guess we learned that with Chase. Don't make the mistake of pushing somebody
Yeah.
down because they dropped a couple balls in practice, right? They
Yeah.
trying new things. These guys with all this, with this elite level of talent, you don't want to buy into that stuff. It will hurt you in the long run. I bought into it and it hurt me. I didn't end up with any Chase as his rookie. So, um, when I could have, and so
Yeah.
anyways, that's Marvin Harrison. And we're going to get into the last player of this video, the last receiver of tier 3. And then we'll do a part 2, breaking down tier 4 through 6. And that is Brandon Ayuk. So you alluded to him a little bit when we were talking about the comparison with Harrison. So why don't you get into Ayuk?
Yeah. My concern with Ayuk this year is I think we're drafting him a little bit closer to his ceiling. And just to dig a little bit deeper on that, last year he still finished as wide receiver 14 despite having, an extremely, extremely efficient year. I just worry with that team where it runs through CMC. If Debo stays healthy, if Kittle is healthy and doing his thing, Ayuk just doesn't necessarily get the volume as to the other guys in the same tier that I'm necessarily comfortable, going with them.
Yeah, Ayuk is an interesting case, right? Because on a per touch, per catch basis, he exceeds all of the guys in this tier, and that's not really arguable. Okay, I mean he had 1,350
Yeah.
yards last year on 80 catches, which is just an
Yeah.
insane level of yards per catch. He's extremely talented after the catch too, so a lot of that is generated by just how good he is with the ball in his hands. But it's the crowded nature of the offense, like you said, that will lead to just down weeks, right? So you'll have these weeks where he goes 8 for 125 and 2 touchdowns, but then you'll also have to deal with the 4 for 40s in a way that these other
Mm-hmm.
guys shouldn't have to deal with that, right? There might be some game script situations where they don't do very well, but these other guys in this tier shouldn't be having as many of those 4 for 40s where you look up at Ayuk and you're not surprised if that happens, right? Like if one of these other guys does it, it's like, dude, come on. Well, like what happened?
Yeah.
Versus with
Yeah.
Ayuk, they could win by 20 and everybody and Debo, Kittle, and McCaffrey go off. And it's like, oh, well, that's just kind of how it is when you draft this guy. So the efficiency is why he gets pushed up here now, right? I mean, we spent 2 straight seasons pushing Ayuk down draft boards around wide receiver, 20. Last year, some people had him up at 15, some people were pushing him up, but for the consensus was around 20. I mean, he was a 5th or 6th round pick, I think, in our draft. And the year before it was even later than that, like 8th or 7th. And so the talent has just started to show through with this. And I think it's just hard to ignore the fact that he's such an efficient player. He's so good with the ball in his hands. And if he did get more volume, he would be the one of this tier that would move up, I think, because of how efficient he is. But just unfortunately, his situation and where he kind of sits within the offense, I think, is what kind of caps his upside overall. So
And the Niners have no reason or incentive to change the way that their offense runs in any way because it's so, barring injury, of course, but we kind of know what it is when it's firing on all cylinders.
yeah, of course, and that also fuels some of the numbers that Ayuk gets. Right, is Kittle goes down for 2 games, and Ayuk is going to be a top 7 receiver during those weeks, right?
Yeah.
Or Debo misses 2 weeks, like he's going to be a top 7 receiver during those weeks. So um, McCaffrey, God forbid he misses any time. Like in the passing game, they're going to have to figure out where those targets are going to go, and maybe that some of that gets distributed to Ayuk. Although I think they would like to keep that within the running back position, but you can't load up just any court or just any running back with 8 targets or 7 targets. So some of that, a couple of those
Yeah.
targets have to get disseminated throughout the rest of the skill position players. So uh, he's an interesting draft pick, right? And we've done a couple mock drafts where he's there in the 4th, 5th round, and we feel like that this is kind of where the tier break happens. And we'll get into that in part 2, right? Where wide receiver 13 feels like a bigger difference from wide receiver 12 than like wide receiver 12 does from wide receiver 8. So, it's an interesting spot to have him because it's not exactly the guy that I would want to target, but he's the guy that sits there right at the end of the tier that if he falls into your lap in a good draft spot, you could possibly end up with a lot of Ayuk this season.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. And with that, we'll wrap up the first three tiers and the top 12 of our wide receivers. We'll get into tiers 4 through 6 in part 2 of this video. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Thanks, guys.